There's only one Pokemon team in the conversation for the strongest of all time. There's only one Pokemon team that has achieved a level of dominance previously thought to be impossible, and afterward inspired countless trainers for a fraction of the power that it possessed. There's only one Pokemon team that has ever truly felt unbeatable, that's made you feel stupid for even daring to think that it could be stopped. There is only one Pokemon team that I fear, and its name is Big Six. It's difficult to put into words just how unbelievable this team was. Those of you not around for the era of Big Six might really struggle to comprehend it, and I don't blame you, because there's never been another team that even got close that I can use as a reference. Even if you didn't play during the Big Six era, which was more technically during the 2016 season, if you're active in the competitive Pokemon space, you've most likely at least come across the name of it before. You've heard the team mentioned that broke so many players, that threatened to consume the entire game itself. But maybe you don't know much more than the Pokemon that were on the team and the fact that it is really scary. Personally, that makes me happy. I'm glad that so many of you didn't have to go through what us old heads went through, that you didn't have to suffer the way that we suffered. If you started following competitive Pokemon since 2016, you'll have experienced a game that was, at least by comparison, much healthier, so much more vibrant. But 2016 and the reign of Big Six can only be described as a travesty, as we stared into the abyss and 6 Pokemon stared back. But for all of the horror that it did cause, Big Six is a really important part of understanding competitive Pokemon's history. And even beyond that, it's a big part of my personal history. You see, Big Six played an enormous role in my own story. And in a way, despite all my awful memories of the team, I wouldn't be here without it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In order to understand just why what Big Six did was so completely out there and why it's never been seen again, we first have to understand what exactly the team was, and specifically, what makes it the strongest team that competitive Pokemon has ever seen. To understand Big Six, we first need to understand the format that this team emerged from. The 2016 season used what is known as a double restricted format. These formats, which are typically the last ones in a generation's life cycle before we move to the next game, allows trainers to use, well, 2 restricted Pokemon, the normally banned behemoth Pokemon that adorn box arts, and the Pokemon that oppose them. To best understand Big Six, we need to start with the restricted Pokemon, and in 2016 there were 2 that stood clearly above the rest. Let's start with one of the most legendary Pokemon ever created, Groudon. For those of you who started following competitive Pokemon during the last year, you might be surprised to see Groudon here. After all, in the current rule set, Groudon is nothing more than a C-tier restricted Pokemon, probably the 9th or 10th best one in the game. Now, of course, back in the day, there were fewer restricted Pokemon to choose from. In fact, Groudon had already leveraged its titanic power and bulk to win worlds the previous time it was legal, 6 years before Big Six, back in 2010. But that Groudon and the Groudon of today in the modern era are not the same as the Groudon that we were dealing with back in 2016. Because in 2016, Groudon received a new form thanks to its mascot status of Omega Ruby, a form known as Primal Groudon. Now, keep in mind, regular Groudon was a great restricted Pokemon for over a decade. It won Worlds the first time its base form was legal. It got second at Worlds the next time it was legal in 2022. Primal Groudon is to regular Groudon as Urshifu is to Hitmonchan, not even in the same ballpark. So, what makes Primal Groudon so much stronger? Well, in 2016, both Groudon forms gained access to a better spread move called Precipice Blades, a signature move at that. A ground move that's not only stronger than Earthquake, but also one that doesn't hit your own partner, at the cost of being slightly inaccurate. Truthfully, out of everything the Groudon received, this one's probably the least impactful. Primal Groudon also gained access to the Fire typing, a typing that maybe it should have had all along. This new type not only gives Primal Groudon a 50% boost on all of its fire moves that already were getting a 50% boost from the strong sunlight that Groudon sets up whenever it switches in, but it also has pretty good synergy with Ground. Ground's weaknesses to ice and grass moves are resisted by fire type attacks, and the rock weakness that fire has is resisted by the ground typing. Of course, there is one glaring problem. With a quadruple weakness to water, Primal Groudon had a glaring weakness, a built-in check to what was looking to be one of the strongest Pokemon of all time. Of course, the sunlight does cut water moves damage in half, but that'll still result in water moves doing double damage when you factor in all the multipliers. Despite setting the sun up and taking away the rain, it still will take so much damage. Taking almost double that will almost certainly be too much. Except that setting the sun up is what regular Groudon does, not what Primal Groudon does. Primal Groudon's ability is not the classic Drought, but instead a new signature ability called Desolate Land. This is effectively the mega evolved version of Strong Sunlight. Desolate Land still activates abilities like Chlorophyll and Solar Power, and any other sun-based ability, and it also still powers up fire moves by 50%. But there are two clear differences between the two weather conditions. First, unlike normal weather conditions, which only last for 5 turns, Primordial weather lasts forever until the setter switches out. The only other way to remove the weather is to override it with another Primordial weather. Weather conditions only available to Primal Kyogre and Mega Rayquaza. Hail, sand, rain, and even a regular sun will fail to make an impact against Desolate Land. And the second condition is even more impactful, because instead of cutting all the damage that water moves do in half like regular sun does, inside of Desolate Land, all water moves evaporate completely, doing exactly 0 damage. So actually, Primal Groudon can switch in without fear against Primal Kyogre, because as long as it has the advantage in the weather war, it has nothing to fear. This was a clear-cut advantage over Kyogre's Primordial Sea, which also had the same effect of extinguishing fire-type moves, but Primal Groudon's go-to attack was Precipice Blades, a ground-type attack capable of doing massive damage to Primal Kyogre. In other words, Primal Groudon could switch in somewhat safely against Kyogre, but the same wasn't true in reverse. Kyogre mostly uses its rain offensively, but Primal Groudon put its own weather to work for both offensive purposes and defensive ones. Of course, Primal Groudon does still have one weakness when the sun was blazing: to ground, but this weakness was not especially easy to exploit. First, most ground-type moves are physical, and Primal Groudon has tremendous physical bulk. Second, there just weren't that many great ground types, other than Primal Groudon, of course. Yes, Landorus Therian existed, but given that it had to rely on Earthquake, it didn't actually do as much damage as you might expect. And frankly, it just wasn't that good in this format because of how strong the other Pokemon were. And to be clear, I did win a regional with Landorus Therian during this year, so I feel somewhat qualified to tell you that it actually wasn't that strong. In other words, if you wanted a good Pokemon to hit Groudon with super effective ground type attacks, which again were the only real way to hit it with super effective damage if you didn't deal with Primordial Sun, your best and kind of your only real answer was your own Primal Groudon. If players wanted to open up the water weakness, they usually had to spend a turn switching around, giving Primal Groudon time to launch the devastating Precipice Blades. Its job was to sit in the field, be nearly impossible to kill, and output consistent damage. Even with Precipice Blades' less than stellar accuracy, Groudon was able to be active for so many turns that you could afford to miss a Precipice Blades here or there. Primal Groudon is a Pokemon with no real equivalent in the modern games. Calyrex, Miraidon, Urshifu, Fluttermane. These are all great Pokemon, and truthfully, they're all broken in their own special ways. But dealing with them is nothing like dealing with Primal Groudon. These Pokemon have counters. It's kind of a crazy concept, putting myself back in 2016 brain, but like, you can stop them if you want. It just might be a little tough. Primal Groudon, not so easy to stop. In many ways, it was the Pokemon that had it all. The first restricted Pokemon on the team, and the Pokemon that was not the single biggest threat on Big 6. Let's talk about the strongest Pokemon on the team. What you have to understand is that Xerneas is the mascot legendary for Pokemon X, and this was the game that introduced the fairy typing to the series. Game Freak clearly wanted players to use these new fairy type Pokemon, and they made fairy type Pokemon so strong in fact that they ended up making it the single best type in the game, even letting weak Pokemon like Wigglytuff win tournaments thanks to their newfound fairy typing. And Xerneas is the cover legendary Pokemon to come out of these games. Game Freak absolutely didn't want it to be seen as weak, as in a way, it would be the mascot for not only the games, but for the typing as a whole. So they decided to make what is, in my opinion, the single most broken Pokemon ever created. Xerneas was the best type in the game, and it has a great ability that powers up its fairy moves even further, as well as the fairy moves of its teammates. But what really makes it broken is its signature move, a move that still makes my stomach drop every time I think about it. A move called Geomancy. Now, Geomancy doesn't do any damage, so how good can it be? To give you an idea, let's talk about another attack, Quiver Dance. It's widely accepted that Quiver Dance is just about the best quote-unquote standard move that you can use to power up one of your Pokemon. By attacking just once, your Pokemon will receive not 1, not 2, but 3 stat boosts, one each in its special attack, special defense, and speed. With just one attack, you become stronger, tankier, and faster. It's a pretty absurd move, and it's mostly relegated to bug-type Pokemon in order to keep it from taking over the game. Geomancy is similar to Quiver Dance. In fact, it also boosts your special attack, special defense, and speed. Except, it isn't on a bug-type Pokemon, but on the strongest fairy-type legendary Pokemon ever created. Oh yeah, and it doesn't raise each of those stats once like Quiver Dance, but instead twice. By clicking Geomancy a single time, Xerneas receives 6 stat boosts, doubling its special attack, special defense, and speed stats. Even Game Freak surely realized how completely unbalanced, how unthinkably game-breaking this is. So, in order to keep Xerneas in check, they made Geomancy take 2 turns. So you still average out to an average of 1 boost per turn, making it a slightly worse Quiver Dance in theory. Except that they messed up, because while Geomancy is supposed to take 2 turns to use, there is one single way around it, with a held item called the Power Herb. Power Herb is a consumable item that, once per battle, lets a Pokemon use a charge attack move in just 1 turn rather than your usual 2. So moves like Solar Beam, Sky Attack, Phantom Force, Dive, and Fly, these types of moves, which we're all familiar with, can be used in 1 turn rather than the usual 2. And you might think, well, Wolf, those moves are all, those are all attacking moves, they do damage. Surely it doesn't apply to Geomancy as well, a setup move, right? Well, that's where you're wrong, because it does apply to Geomancy, which means that suddenly, Geomancy isn't 2 Quiver Dances over 2 turns, it's 2 Quiver Dances in 1 turn, all for the cost of holding 1 measly little red leaf. And that is just too much value. Yveltal might be the life-draining Pokemon, but Geomancy boosted Xerneas is the true avatar of destruction. Once it's set up, it can run through teams solo, outspeeding every opponent as it lays waste with Dazzling Gleams and Moonblasts, all while nearly invulnerable to special attacks thanks to its good natural bulk, now having doubled special defense. Xerneas was so powerful that it didn't even need to run any coverage moves. Between Fairy Aura and Geomancy, even Pokemon that resisted Fairy would find themselves to hit KO'd a lot of the time by Moonblast. It's one of the rare times that we saw almost no experimentation with a Pokemon's moves or item. Geomancy Power Herb was so strong that nobody felt the need to use anything else. What was really messed up is just how well Primal Groudon and Xerneas synergized with each other. Yes, both of them had incredibly powerful spread moves, which let them create incredibly tight pins. And yes, Groudon was incredibly physically bulky, while Xerneas was basically untouchable on the special side. But the most unfair part of playing against this duo was their typing. Part of the reason that Xerneas only needed to use Fairy moves, apart from Fairy Aura, was the fact that Primal Groudon filled in its gaps perfectly. Only 3 types resist Fairy: Steel, Poison, and Fire. All 3 of these types are weak to ground, and 2 of those types just happen to be Fairy's only weaknesses, both of which Primal Groudon also resists. On the flip side, every type that resists ground is neutral to Fairy. Against a boosted Xerneas, neutral might as well mean that you're actually quite weak to it. Outside of the typing, Xerneas covered Groudon's matchups very well. Primal Kyogre was kind of essential to letting any Pokemon one-shot Primal Groudon, but Xerneas matched up incredibly well into Kyogre teams. Often these teams would try to run Tailwind to make Kyogre's Water Spout move first, but because Xerneas is so naturally fast, after a Geomancy, it still outruns Kyogre even if they have Tailwind up, which lets it weaken Water Spout's huge damage before they can attack. And given that Xerneas also has a +2 boost to its special defense, it can easily shrug off any of Kyogre's attacks. Once Kyogre was dealt with, Groudon would have permanent weather control, and likely a permanent dub in the wins column. And Xerneas and Primal Groudon aren't even the only Pokemon on this team with remarkably good synergy. See, X and Y didn't just introduce the Fairy typing, they also introduced Mega Evolutions. Mega Salamence was commonly accepted as one of the best Mega Evolutions in the game. Its incredible base speed and unbelievable stats surely played a role, but what really made Salamence stand out was its new ability, Aerialate. I think it might be pronouncing, I think it might be Aerialate, but I always said Aerialate, nobody ever corrected me, so I'm gonna say Aerialate. Anyway, this ability turns all normal type moves into flying type moves, and at the time, gave them all a 30% power boost. Flying is a great offensive type, but it's held back by its lack of good moves. With Aerialate, Mega Salamence suddenly not only had access to actual reliable flying type coverage, but it could do so using powered up moves that weren't even intended to be flying type. As a bonus, Salamence was one of the few Mega Pokemon who helped your team out before Mega Evolving, and it did so with one of the best abilities in the game, Intimidate. This was especially useful for Big 6, because while Xerneas has obvious synergy with Intimidate thanks to Geomancy boosting its special defense and Intimidate, boosting its physical defense effectively, Groudon also benefits thanks to its typing. Remember, the ground type moves are mainly physical, so with Intimidate around, your option was to either try and hit Groudon for neutral damage on the special side, or you could hit it for super effective damage, but into a huge physical defense stat while also having to battle through Salamence's Intimidates. On top of the attack drops, Mega Salamence brought utility via the move Tailwind. doubling the speeds of its team for the next 4 turns. Now keep in mind that this was 2 generations prior to dynamic speed being introduced to the game. If that doesn't make any sense, basically what you need to know is that in the current games, when you use a move that affects the speeds of the battle, it takes place immediately. For example, in the current games, if you have a Whimsicott Kyogre on the field and your Whimsicott uses Tailwind, your Kyogre immediately receives the benefit of having double speed. But that's not how it used to work. It used to be that the turn order was set at the beginning of the turn, so in that same example, if Whimsicott used Tailwind, Kyogre wouldn't receive the benefit of that Tailwind until the following turn. The reason this is relevant to Mega Salamence is that it actually made it quite a good Tailwind user, because nowadays most Tailwind Pokemon, not all of them, but most of them really like to have the Prankster ability just to make sure they can always get the immediate benefit to its partner, and back in the day that was much less of a big deal. So, putting it all together, we have a Pokemon that not only passively supports its team with Intimidate, it could also support its team with its attack Tailwind. And that's just considering what Mega Salamence could do when it wasn't attacking. With not 1, but 2 great attacking stats, Mega Salamence often used both a physical and a special attack so that it could always use whichever one did more damage. It mostly used the insanely powerful Double Edge on the physical side for more burst damage, and the spread attack Hyper Voice on the special side to whittle opponents down over time. When it came to dealing with opposing Primal Groudon, Mega Salamence was also quite effective, with Hyper Voice doing actually a surprising amount of damage to the very frail Groudon that were most common at the beginning of the format. And being a flying dragon type with Intimidate, that's just about everything you could ask for when you're trying to find an answer to the Dawn. Despite its dragon typing, Mega Salamance's Xerneas matchup wasn't too shabby either. Since it naturally outsped, it could set up Tailwind before they used Geomancy, or it could use its massive physical attack stat to launch Aerialate boosted Double Edges that really didn't care about Geomancy's boosts. But if Salamance's matchups against Xerneas were good, the only thing better might be its synergy with Xerneas, specifically Groudon. The only 3 types that resist flying are weak to ground, while flying hits 2 of the types that resist ground themselves for super effective damage, and hits the last one, flying itself, for neutral damage. This was a ridiculously strong Pokemon on its own, who was generally thought to be the 2nd best Mega Pokemon in the game. Wait, 2nd best? Why would the strongest Pokemon team of all time not use the best Mega Evolution? Well, about that, on the whole, I think that I like Mega Evolution far less than your average Pokemon fan. In fact, to be honest, I'm not even completely sure that I do like Mega Evolution. And when I think about why I feel that way, it all comes back to one single painful thought: Mega Kangaskhan in Generation 6. Mega Kangaskhan is another contender for being one of the strongest Pokemon of all time. At this point, Big 6 basically looks like an all-star roster, which is pretty much how it functioned. In a lot of ways, Mega Kangaskhan was similar to Groudon. Bulky as all get out, only 1 weakness, built to sit in the field and just pump out damage. But where Groudon had spread moves, Kangaskhan had some other nasty tricks up her sleeve. Power Up Punch was a weak fighting type move that gives the user an attack boost. Doesn't sound so broken, right? Except that Mega Kangaskhan's ability is Parental Bond, causing all attacks that it uses to hit twice. And that means that Power Up Punch gave not 1 boost, but 2. And the attack boost that the first hit did would immediately apply to the second hit. Compare this to the move Swords Dance, considered one of the best setup moves in the game. It also gives 2 attack boosts, but doesn't do any damage. Power Up Punch wasn't even the only issue. Fake Out is one of the best supporting moves in the game, as it stops a target from moving for a turn. It's intended to be quite a weak attack, except between Parental Bond, the same type attack bonus, and Kangaskhan's good attacking stat, Fake Out did a sizable chunk of damage all on its own. Fake Out wasn't even the only support that Kangaskhan could provide. With the strong priority move Sucker Punch, it could help finish off weakened foes. Or it could simply KO your opponent's Pokemon itself, with its incredibly strong normal type attacks, Return, and Double Edge. It wasn't technically a restricted Pokemon, but sometimes it sure felt like it. And this is part of what made Kangaskhan so threatening on this team. Fake Out could support Xerneas as it's set up, sure. Sucker Punch could finish off a Pokemon that barely survived an attack from Groudon, yes. But if you ignored Kangaskhan and tried to deal with the Xerneas or the Groudon first, suddenly you could find yourself losing a Pokemon to Double Edge. Or worse, find Kangaskhan doubling its attack with Power Up Punch. Now you have to deal with both Primal Groudon and a souped up Mega Kangaskhan. Think about just a very simple lead: Xerneas and Kangaskhan. If you think Kangaskhan's gonna Fake Out while Xerneas uses Geomancy, well, you should probably use your Pokemon to try and get some damage on Xerneas, which basically requires you to attack with both of your Pokemon into Xerneas, as you can't be sure which one Kangaskhan's gonna Fake Out. But what if Xerneas protects while Kangaskhan just uses Power-Up Punch? Well, if that's what you think is going to happen, then you should double Kangaskhan. But if you guess wrong, you're immediately so far behind, as Fake Out plus Geomancy could just be game losing if you don't damage Xerneas. And this is just one example of the many Saw Trap puzzles that Kangaskhan would use. Of course, there is an elephant in the room. This team already has a Mega in Salamence. Isn't having 2 Mega Pokemon on the same team kind of bad? Well, most of the time, putting 2 Mega Pokemon on one team requires some consideration, since most of the time you're not going to be able to bring them together to the same battles. And well, yeah, you're probably not bringing Salamence and Kangaskhan together most of the time unless you're doing some weird like Intimidate, Tailwind, Support Salamence shenanigans. The cost you pay to run 2 Megas is way lower than normal in this format. In competitive play, you bring 6 Pokemon to a match, but only select 4 each battle. Having 2 Megas on your team means effectively, each match you need to pick only 4 out of your 5, since you shouldn't bring both Mega Pokemon together. But since this team already has both Xerneas and Groudon, they're probably going to be coming to most of the battles on their own. So instead of picking 4 out of 5, you're instead really picking 2 out of 3. And that makes it way easier to justify leaving one of your Megas behind. To give you an idea of how broken Mega Kangaskhan was in Generation 6, let's look to the future, to Generation 7 when it was nerfed into the ground. In Generation 7, Game Freak changed Parental Bond from a 50% additional attack to 25%, removed Power-Up Punch from its moveset, and nerfed Sucker Punch. And Mega Kangaskhan was still one of the best Mega evolutions. Now, consider Mega Kangaskhan before it was nerfed. With 4 of our attackers covered, let's talk about support, starting with the strongest regional bird that we've ever seen, Talonflame. Pokemon with an ability so good that it managed to be a top threat, even though it has a worse attacking stat than Amoonguss. Those of you who didn't play during Generation 6 might be surprised to hear this, but Talonflame was one of the single best Pokemon in the game at the time, and could even keep up in a format dominated by Xerneas and Primal Groudon. See, in Generation 6, Talonflame's Gale Wings ability gave all of its flying moves increased priority with no qualifications. And it turns out, having a 120 base power move that you can use before any other Pokemon attacks for the turn is pretty good. While its attack stat left quite a bit to be desired, Groudon's Sun meant that Flare Blitz could do good damage, while supporting moves like Quick Guard, Will-O-Wisp, Taunt, and most importantly Tailwind ensured that Xerneas could get its job done. Now, I don't want to talk too much about Talonflame, because while the original Big 6 team featured Talonflame, when players updated and adapted the team, it was usually the first Pokemon to go. It's more important to understand Talonflame on a conceptual level, that the Pokemon in this slot's job is to primarily support your team, especially by making your partner Pokemon move before your opponent. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because there's still one Pokemon left that I've yet to cover, and I've saved it for last for a reason. It's arguably the most toxic Pokemon in the entire history of the game. It's a Pokemon that turned the entire format into a nightmare, literally. Even now, almost a decade later, it's difficult for me to talk about, but you have to know. The one Pokemon that has come the closest to truly killing competitive Pokemon, Smeargle. At first glance, Smeargle doesn't seem like a very threatening Pokemon. It's a pure normal type with less stat points total than Fletchling. So if you didn't know anything about competitive Pokemon, you might think that all this buildup has been for some kind of joke. But there's nothing funny about Smeargle. Smeargle's signature gimmick is simple. Via its signature move Sketch, it can learn any 4 moves in the game without qualifiers. The Artist Pokemon allows its trainer to harness the unlimited power of the creative imagination, treating their very Pokemon itself as blank canvas. The 4 move slots, the 4 boundaries of the frame, the only ones an aspiring maestro need keep mind of. Let instinct and design meet, creating an infinite number of paintings, each unique in their composition. Well, okay, not quite infinite. 620 possible moves to sketch. That's 146,337,616,680 possible movesets for Smeargle, bursting with different colors. And in the era of closed team sheets, no way for your opponent to tell which one you'd chosen until far too late. Funnily enough, despite the nearly limitless freedom that Smeargle afforded, there was one move that every single Smeargle ran. Every single one. A universe of creative potential plunged into darkness by one move. The signature move of another Pokemon stolen by Smeargle. Dark Void. Dark Void is, of course, Darkrai's signature move, but with Darkrai always banned from competitive play, feels much more like it belongs to Smeargle. And it turns out the copy is just as potent, if not more so. Dark Void is a move that puts whatever it hits to sleep with 80% accuracy. That targets both Pokemon on the opponent's side of the field. Now, keep in mind that Spore is commonly accepted to be one of the best moves in the game, and it only hits one target, and it doesn't work on grass types or Pokemon holding the safety goggles item. In other words, in exchange for just a 20% accuracy cut, Smeargle's able to potentially send half your opponent's team out of commission for up to 3 turns. Competitive battles rarely last much longer than 10 turns, and that was even more true back in 2016, when Pokemon like Primal Groudon and Xerneas could KO most of the Pokedex in a single move. Sending 2 Pokemon to sleep for 3 turns often meant that their time doing anything useful on the battlefield was over. The only saving grace was Dark Void's imperfect accuracy, making it risky to use. Right? Well, that 20% accuracy drop only applies some of the time, thanks to Smeargle's downright stupid ability, Moody. This is a goofy ability, one that raises one random stat by 2 stages every turn and lowers another stat by 1 stage, and that includes both evasion and accuracy. Often, when Moody is used, it's to create a Pokemon that sits in the field forever and can't be killed. One that can use almost all the stats and play a long game until the boosts outweigh the drops. So you might think that Smeargle would be a poor candidate for this ability, given its pitiful stats everywhere but its speed. That Moody would be more of a whimsical flavor text than anything actually useful. But if there's anything that I know about Smeargle, it's that it can suck the whimsy and joy out of anything, no matter how colorful. And in fact, those terrible stats are exactly why Smeargle was such a good Moody user. See, Smeargle didn't really care about dropping either attack stat, or even about dropping one of its defense stats, because it was so weak and frail in the first place. The only stat drops that it really cared about were accuracy or speed. On the flip side, nearly every boost outside of the attacking stats was impactful. A defense boost in the right stat might let Smeargle live for another attack, sticking around to get another Moody boost or to fire off another Dark Void. A weighted gamble given that a defense drop would rarely hurt it. And if it ever did get an evasion, speed, or accuracy boost, it could run away with the game. Accuracy meant that Dark Void could now never miss, evasion meant that you'd no longer have a safe way to get rid of Smeargle, and speed would mean your previously safe path of outspeeding it and knocking it out before it could Dark Void just got closed down. Sure, you were rolling the dice on Smeargle's boosts, and sometimes you wouldn't get anything useful, or Moody would actually end up hurting you. But for the most part, you were playing with loaded dice. Not literally though, there is an item called loaded dice, but that item wasn't in the game yet. Not that Smeargle would have wanted it. See, nearly every Smeargle ran Focus Sash to guarantee they could survive one move, which is pretty standard for frail supporting Pokemon, and a big part of the reason that those defense drops didn't matter. Nearly every Smeargle ran Focus Sash. Normally when I say that is because the rest of the items don't impact the way that you would approach the Pokemon, but in Smeargle's case, those rare mix-ups could instantly lose you the game. See, one common approach to Smeargle was to just taunt it. The thought being, if I'm gonna have to double attack this Pokemon anyway to remove it, why not just use one attack instead to taunt it and then stop it from doing anything annoying? So you taunt the Smeargle, ignore it with your other Pokemon, and it was holding the Mental Herb item, and now my whole team is asleep. Instant game over. Or no, maybe it was Choice Scarf Smeargle just to get Dark Void off before the taunt could come out. Oops, no. Maybe it was Focus Sash, but it's also running Magic Coat, and now oops, I'm taunted instead and I can't use Protect to dodge the Dark Void coming out the next turn, which, by the way, is now unmissable because it got the accuracy boost. It turns out when a Pokemon can learn literally every move and can hold any item in the game, there's almost no way to safely counter it. The point is that each Smeargle was a big question mark, except for Dark Void. The problem was, Dark Void wasn't even the only move that you had to worry about. There were a ton of other moves that could immediately lose you the game if you didn't cover for them. Smeargle could use Fake Out, Follow Me, Crafty Shield, Wide Guard, Spiky Shield, Map Block, Trick Room, Helping Hand, Skill Swap, Roleplay. Heck, it could even transform into one of your restricted Pokemon, or their own Primal Groudon or boosted Xerneas. Now look, you can do the thing where you name niche options with every Pokemon, but with Smeargle, these are all moves that people actually were using. Who knows what avant-garde Smeargle build you were facing? The fear of every artistic abomination you'd faced before would flicker before your eyes, the last thing you saw before being sent to an eternal slumber. To be honest though, there were two other moves that you could often count on. I've focused on Dark Void here, but Smeargle had another signature niche. In addition to being the only Pokemon who could use Dark Void, Smeargle was the only Pokemon in existence to have access to the two best commonplace supporting moves, Fake Out and Follow Me. This made it the perfect partner for, oh, I don't know, a Pokemon who maybe wants to set up on turn 1? Forget Darkrai. Playing against Smeargle was the true living nightmare. This is the final bit of synergy pulling this team together. Smeargle could get your team so much momentum that the other overwhelming parts of Big 6 were liable to take over. You had some of the strongest offensive Pokemon of all time, supported by the most devastating support Pokemon ever created. Think about pairing Smeargle with Kangaskhan, for example. On turn 1, you needed to be afraid of Dark Void plus Power Up Punch, Dark Void plus Kang Fake Out, Smeargle Fake Out plus Power Up Punch, Smeargle Follow Me plus Power Up Punch. If you thought you were safe to protect both your Pokemon to stall the first turn to wait out the Fake Out pressure, in a best case scenario, you would still be giving Smeargle the chance to get a free Moody boost. And in a worst case scenario, the Big 6 player could call out your protects, switch Smeargle into Primal Groudon, Talonflame, or Xerneas, and go for a Power Up Punch into their own partner, doubling Kangaskhan's attack while bringing in a Pokemon with a good matchup. Kangaskhan wasn't the only threatening Pokemon to pair with Smeargle either. Obviously, Xerneas introduces some of the same mind games, but there's also Mega Salamence. Smeargle could help get Tailwind up with Fake Out, and then exploit its now doubled speed to launch a Dark Void before your opponents could move, while Salamence went to town. But Smeargle's best synergy was of course its simplest, and its most frustrating, as a facilitator to Xerneas. It didn't matter what your counterplay was to Xerneas. Smeargle could have the counterplay for your counterplay. Trying to hit it directly? Get Fake Outed or forced to target Smeargle with Follow Me. Trying to use Taunt? Meet Crafty Shield. Trying to hit it with a spread move? Here's Wide Guard. And now you understand the whole team. I will say it's really difficult to get across just how powerful this team was, just how much terror and fear it caused, and the manner of the doubt it instilled. If you watched a previous video I made talking about Chalk, you'll remember that I described that team as one founded on stability, a team that was remarkably consistent thanks to, well, consistent moves and Pokemon. Big 6 was the opposite. It thrived on variance. This was not a team where everything was neat and tidy. You had to contend with Precipice Blaze accuracy, Dark Void missing, sleep turns, Moody boosts, just to name a few. And still, even despite all that RNG, the team was downright soul-crushing, maybe even because of all the luck involved. It was basically impossible to create a stable plan to take down this team, and more often than not, the luck would favor the player using Big 6 rather than the one playing against it. Now, of course, lots of teams sound really strong when you sit down and explain their synergy, so I can't be sure if I'm really doing a good job getting across that this time really was different, that this really was the nightmare, not just for me, but for all competitive players. To try and hammer it home, I've got 3 things to tell you about Big 6. First, other than the restricted Pokemon, every single Pokemon present on Big 6 was heavily nerfed at the next opportunity. Kangaskhan, as we mentioned, had Parental Bond's damage reduced, lost Power Up Punch, and got Sucker Punch weakened across the board. Salamance's Aerialate ability was nerfed from a 30% damage boost to a 20% one. Talonflame had Gale Wings changed to only activate while it's at full HP, immediately dropping at several places on the tier list. And Smeargle not only was forbidden from ever using Dark Void again, as it was changed to one of the only moves that Sketch won't copy, and for good measure, they nerfed Dark Void's accuracy from 80% to 50%, even though Smeargle wasn't supposed to be able to use it. But they also reworked Moody to no longer interact with the evasion or accuracy stats, removing several of Smeargle's most frustrating outs. Primal Groudon was essentially removed from the game, and Xerneas isn't present in Scarlet and Violet. Not true nerfs, but you have to wonder after what Big 6 did. Now, despite these nerfs, every single one of these Pokemon would go on to win many more tournaments in future games. Okay, second thing about Big 6. It was so dominant that it is the only time in history where the Pokemon Company International stated that they were monitoring the situation and were considering banning Dark Void from competitive play. In the end, they decided against it, a decision that nearly the entire community disagreed with, but the fact that this was the only time that a mid-season ban was on the table should speak for itself. The third thing I want to tell you about Big 6 is a little bit more personal. Those of you who watch this channel regularly know that I really love using weird, off-the-wall Pokemon, and that was way more true back in the day. The teams that I was using during this era of competitive play were often more strange than good, but I found some ways of making them work. Sometimes. I almost never played standard teams, a sentiment that still continues to my present day. Even nowadays when I do use standard Pokemon, I find a way of making them feel unique and my own. I brought Big 6 to an official tournament twice. At Virginia Regionals where I finished in the top 16, and later Georgia Regionals where I finished top 4. The team was so strong, so unbeatable, that there were times where I faltered and believed that nothing out there could stop it, and that my only chance of winning was to use it. But again, getting ahead of myself. Because in order to truly understand this team and the impact that it had, we have to start at the beginning and go through the history of the single strongest team ever made. 2016's dual restricted format officially kicked off on, as you might expect, January 1st, 2016. But our story starts a few weeks earlier, at grassroots tournaments in Japan. Players here had already started experimenting with dual restricted teams before the format officially changed. Here, Big Six was born. And who should take notice other than my good friend Marcus Hamon? If you watched my chalk video, you know that Marcus pretty frequently has his pulse on the Japanese scene. It's a pretty common pattern in our friendship that Marcus will tell me about a Japanese team, and a few weeks later we see it popping up around the rest of the world for a bit. Hello, it's me from the future. So in doing research for this video, I discovered that the origin of Big Six is actually a little bit difficult to pinpoint. I was personally always under the impression that it came from Japan, and the reason for that I believe is because the earliest instance that I could find of anybody using Big Six was from a Japanese player who went by the name of Tony, who was a very accomplished Japanese player back in the day, and he used it actually in a friendly match against Team Germany. However, prior to Tony using this team in the show match, there was actually a UK player named William Tansley who got to number 1 on the showdown ladder using 5 of the same Big Six Pokemon, I believe. A lot of the records are a little bit hazy, to say the least. It's not easy to get information, but I believe he reached number 1 on the ladder using Clefairy and Choice Scarf Smeargle, which, like, not exactly Big Six, obviously, but it wasn't so far away that I felt like I should not mention it. Anyway, many players believe the team originated in Japan, but of course, as with many ideas in Pokemon, it's hard to pinpoint an exact starting point. This time, however, it wouldn't be for just a bit, and the person helping to start the snowball that would eventually take over the entire game was none other than Marcus himself. Marcus brought Big Six in its original form to the very first regionals of the format in Stockholm, Sweden, where he proceeded to win the whole thing. Our friend Billa also hopped on the team and made top 8 at that same tournament. Our first thoughts about the team were, wow, this is strong, really strong, but it's fine, we'll beat it. See, there's a universal truth in Pokemon. Any team can be beaten if you know exactly what's coming, given that you're willing to spend enough time and energy to figure it out. No matter how powerful the machine, once you figure out the power source, you can shut it down. I like to think of Pokemon metagames like a healthy ecosystem. Sure, there are predators at the top of the food chain, but they exist in balance with other teams, preying on the smaller teams and balking at the rare counters that can make them prey in turn. One single team can't take over the game entirely because the entire ecosystem would collapse. At least, that's what we thought before we met Big Six, and it's what seemed to hold true at first. 1 week later, in Preganzio, I'm so sorry to all the Italians, regionals, Big Six is on 3 of the top 8 teams, sure, but it doesn't win the event. On the same day, Wakefield UK regionals, again, 3 Big Six teams, but none of them make the finals. Instead, it's Jamie Boyd's Rayogre and Alex Gomez's dual primals that keep the last battle safe. For a time, it seemed like the threat had been quelled. Ecosystem restored. How little did we know? Jump to a few weeks later. There have been a few other tournaments in that time, and Big Six has shown up in the top cuts, sure. It even won another regional in Glasgow, but it's not quite as dominant as we feared. People are experimenting with other builds, and it looks like they could give Big Six a run for its money. But today is Valentine's Day 2016, the day of the first North American regional of the year, held in Doswell, Virginia, and with a few weeks of data under their belts, the North American players have a different idea about the format. They think that there is one clear best team. When the dust settles, not only are there 2 different Big Six teams in the finals, 6 out of the 8 teams in top cut are all Big Six. There was no going back. Big Six had proven that it wasn't just a flash in the pan, and now spread like an invasive species, snatching up precious top cut spots from less fortunate teams. Healthy ecosystem be damned. This team is a freak of nature. Think about how crazy it is to have a performance this strong so early into a format. It's not like everyone at the event was using Big Six, so to have this dominant of a showing was unheard of, especially given that this tournament was best of 1. You would think that with so much variance and so little room for error, the teams at the top would, by definition, need to have a decent bit of variety. But not for the last time, Big Six played us for fools. Now, normally when a team is overperforming, the solution is simple. Counter team it. There's a natural law of Pokemon. If you know what's coming, you can design a response to beat it. But here's the thing. We were trying to do that, and it wasn't working. This was no regular predator. It was a highly intelligent, highly adaptable creature from another planet, straight out of your horror film nightmares, capable of morphing on the fly to seemingly whatever we threw at it. Put simply, this team would mutate. When I'm telling the story, it might seem like with hindsight, players should have been able to figure it out. But I want to be clear, again, this was a team unlike anything that we had seen before, or since. Whether it was the tools of the new team, the roulette game you signed on to when you saw a Smeargle on the other side, or just the fact that these new Pokemon were so strong, Big Six seemed to have the tools to thwart its would-be solutions. The best minds in Pokemon were trying as hard as possible to beat Big Six for the span of the format. Now, for a bit, players thought they could beat Big Six with Trick Room, turning the high base speeds of the team against it. But then, Big Six changed. And to see how, all we need to do is look at the teams at Doswell. See, I said there were 6 Big Six teams, but you might notice that only 4 of those teams fit the Big Six mode that we've been dealing with before. The others incorporate a different Pokemon. And it's here that we talk about the first Big Six variant, Big C. As an aside, you might be wondering why this team was called Big Six. Well, back in the day, Big Six was just a term that we used to describe kind of the most popular team at the moment. Like, oh, what's the Big Six of this format? However, this team was just so powerful and so different that it kind of just absorbed the name forever. So now Big Six only ever refers to this team, and its variants are big, with the letter replacement. Big B, Big C, Big A, etc. Big E is one. Anyway, in the Big C variant, you swap out Talonflame for Cresselia, and suddenly, the Trick Room your opponents were hoping would beat you is actually now much more of a boon for you. With Cresselia on the team over Talonflame, Big Six can function in any form of speed control, be it Salamence's Tailwind or Cresselia's Trick Room. Cresselia's addition also allowed the team to drop some speed in favor of bulk, making it even more difficult to remove Primal Groudon. Cresselia also enabled one of my personal all-time favorite moves, Skill Swap. This was the year where Skill Swap was one of the best moves in the game, because not only could you steal your opponent's Parental Bond or Aerialate, weakening them significantly, but if you used Skill Swap on Primal Groudon, you would not only make it immune to all ground-type moves, which is its only weakness inside of Desolate Land, but you would also reset Desolate Land if it wasn't active. This was a way to regain control of the weather without needing to switch Primal Groudon out. So if Trick Room was up, Cresselia could regain control of the weather without needing Groudon to switch. In other words, with one single move, you could turn Primal Groudon into a Pokemon immune to its only 2 weaknesses. Now, changing just one Pokemon on a team might not seem like the crazy mutation ability that I just hyped up. After all, teams change all the time, right? But what's notable about Big Six is how easily it seemed to accommodate these changes. It didn't matter that you changed out a whole Pokemon, the core of the team was so strong that it could easily function on its own. And what that meant was that Big Six could change that slot over and over. And what that meant was that it seemed like it could adapt to anything. Imagine 6 months of trying to beat this team. These days, we would have watched as the team came and went with a new regulation, a new rule set. But in 2016, the format lasted for a whole year, and players were spending all of that time trying to beat just one singular team and largely getting nowhere. Because there weren't just players trying to beat Big Six, there were also other players trying to improve it, to push it beyond the heights it had so quickly reached. This created a tug-of-war effect, where sometimes the format would suddenly lurch towards a team that seemed to be able to beat Big Six, only for the Big Six player to adapt, update the team, and continue their unrelenting march towards victory. It didn't matter how much we threw at it, Big Six was unfazed, a giant to whom all of our assaults was nothing more than a tickle at its toes. Sometimes this would be through that 6th man slot, sometimes through more minute team adjustments, maybe a moveset changed on Smeargle or the stats of Kangaskhan changed. We saw players run through a whole alphabet of 6th Mons, Big A with Amoonguss, the other Big C with Crobat, the other Big C with Clefairy, Big E, Big M, Big R, Big T, whatever letters player needed to shut down those foolish enough to believe that Big Six could be stopped. But the 3 most popular variants were the original with Talonflame, Big C with Cresselia, and one last team which we haven't quite gotten to yet. Now, a quick caveat here on the counter teams that I want to mention. If you really wanted to build a team that could just hard counter Big Six, that was possible. It wasn't like this team was literally unbeatable, but beating just Big Six and its variants wouldn't win you tournaments. Because despite being clearly the best team in the format, Big Six still wasn't every team in the format. It probably only ever reached around 40% usage at its peak, which is still a disgusting amount. One example of this were so-called X-ray teams that used both Xerneas and Mega Rayquaza. These teams were pretty good and had good Big Six matchups, but they often would use Pokemon like Seismitoad in order to do it. Sure, your team might win hard in the most popular matchup, but what about against the other counter teams, or about the players who just wanted to pretend that Big Six didn't exist? You still had to be able to beat them, and you were saddled with a 136-pound Toad on your back who came really just for one matchup. That's actually how much Seismitoad weighs. I don't know why I looked that up. Pokemon tournaments live on a wire's edge. At the time, losing 2 or 3 sets meant that your tournament was immediately over. So let's say you built the perfect counter team, and you could beat every Big Six team you faced. Awesome, but that's not even going to be half of your opponents. And if you can't beat X-Ray, Dual Primals, Rayogre, or Radon, you weren't going to be able to make it to the finals to stop Big Six from winning anyway. The only chance for redemption was to complete a task that seemed impossible. Build a team that could beat both Big Six and the rest of the field. And every time somebody made a team that accomplished that first task, Big Six adapted, leaving you with a mutant that had evolved into an evolutionary niche that was now obsolete. If you wanted to beat both Big Six and the field, well, the best choice seemed to be Big Six. For the rest of the season, Big Six reigned. It had down moments, sure, where those counter teams popped up, but it always came back to the top of the pyramid. Big Six variants went on to win 7 more regionals, including several more events where more than half of the top cut was sporting the team. Just look at this graphic and tell me you've ever seen another team like this. In fact, there were only 3 events over the entire season where a Big Six team didn't make top 8. Florida Regionals, which was instead won by well, it was me, but I actually don't really know what I was doing here. Eindhoven Regionals in the Netherlands, again, sorry for the pronunciation, not doing it on purpose, which still featured 2 Big Six adjacent Xerneas teams in the finals. I mean, we're saying that this isn't Big Six when it's really just running a different Intimidate flying type Pokemon over Salamence. And the United Kingdom Nationals. To really understand the history of this tournament, you've got to understand the way that the old Pokemon circuit worked. While these days we have 4 international championships a year, back in the old days we had national championships for many of the biggest countries. These tournaments were similar to today's internationals, the main exception being that people almost never traveled outside their own region. And if you went to one of these tournaments and you weren't from the region, you'd be made fun of online and called a wallet warrior. Just like internationals, nationals was just one step down from the world championships, the biggest tournaments you could find before the year's crowning event, with the qualification points to match. If you were developing a strategy to beat Big Six, there was a good argument to be made that you should be keeping it under wraps until nationals to have the best shot to make worlds. And that's exactly what Alex Gomez did. You might remember Alex Gomez's name from the very beginning of our history, when he placed second at a UK regional using dual primals. This time though, Alex wasn't at a regional with 87 players, he was at a national with 315. And this time, he wasn't settling for second, he was taking first, with the same archetype he'd brought to Wakefield months before. Alex led a wave of dual primal teams that swarmed the United Kingdom, taking Big Six's spot seemingly overnight. Dual primals refers to the combination of both Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre on the same team. While it might seem unintuitive since their weathers compete with one another, you were also using 2 of the strongest legendaries ever created. And of course, having both forms of primal weather meant that you would always have a counter to your opponent's Groudon or Kyogre. If you were winning the weather war, you were often winning the match. But with dual primals, if you were losing it, you still had a shot, because that weather could work for you as well. 6 of the top 8 teams were some version of dual primals, and the spots below them didn't look great for Big Six either. Of the top 32 teams, only 3 of them even had Xerneas and Groudon, and the one that took second only bore a passing resemblance to the format's former top team. Big Six had been down before, but rarely had it looked so out. Could this finally be it? Had light finally been visited upon the land at last? Had the tyranny without end finally ceased? The true test of that bright future would come in just a few days' time. Back in 2016, since most countries had their own nationals instead of one consolidated international, you'd get all the European nationals in a row, and German nationals were set to take place 1 week later. If Big Six was going to pull its adaptation trick, this was the place. So German nationals go down, and yeah, Big Six isn't dead. Look at all these familiar looking Xerneas teams. But I say Xerneas, not Big Six, for a reason. Because if you take a close look, you can see that quite a few of these teams weren't replacing the Talonflame or the Cresselia slot. They were including Cresselia and leaving behind one of the Megas in favor of a very specific Pokemon. Thundurus. Thundurus not only offered speed control in the form of Thunder Wave, it was also one of the premier answers to Kyogre in the game, not just because of Thunderbolt, but because of its attack roleplay, which could be used just like Skill Swap to reset Desolate Land. Now, to be clear, saying that this isn't a Big Six variant is kind of splitting hairs at this point. A lot of people would still say that this new variant was Big Six, but I do want to draw attention to this disruption of the true core of Big Six. One that's been a little bit more dramatic than anything we'd seen before, because it had far-reaching consequences. Big Six certainly wasn't dead. A look at some of the following regionals shows more than enough proof of life, even with the versions that didn't feature Thundurus. But that wasn't the whole story. At other regionals, new teams are starting to rise to the top. Dual Primals, Radon, Yveltal started to look healthier. Big Six was still strong, of course, but for the first time, its blood had been spilled. What gives? Well, the answer lies back at those German nationals and that thunderous adaptation. For the first time, the primary Big Six adaptation had disrupted those core 5. It wasn't just the 6th man getting swapped out, it was a member of the core roster. We've said that the reason that Big Six could function so well was because that core 5 are so solid together, and now they had been disrupted. This thunderous variant, built to handle dual primals, wasn't as cohesive as the original variations, which only changed the Talonflame slot, and found itself weaker against other teams, especially opposing Xerneas, since you were likely dropping one of your physical attacking megas. Now, not everybody ran this variant. Some people stuck with Big C or Talonflame or the other versions, but those versions struggled against dual primals and other Kyogre teams. But the Thunderous variant had some Xerneas problems, and so something unprecedented had finally happened. The Big Six variants now had to choose which matchups they were willing to punt on. This seemed like the culmination of months of counterattacks. At last, the weight of the adaptations had stacked up, 1,000 spinning plates, and while Big Six might have a lot of hands, it finally needed to let just one drop. And that's when another team breaks through. The best example was at Italian Nationals, where players reveled in their newfound variety. You had X-Ray and Ryogre teams partying up at the top, and even non-primal Kyogre made an appearance in the top 4 with Choice Scarf. And there was just one Big Six in the corner of top 8, sullenly sipping its drink and saying, "They don't even know I used to win every tournament." Yeah, buddy, we do know. Dual Primals had presented a big threat. As always, Big Six adapted. But this time, the adaptation wasn't as airtight, and a ripple effect had spread. The burden of dealing with that one team had opened the door for other teams. The metagame, in other words, had shifted. Big Six was still a competitor, but a humbled one, not the almighty overseer that had dictated the meta. And then came US Nationals. US Nationals back in the day was always the final tournament before Worlds. The last chance for players to finalize their understanding of what worked and test new ideas before the biggest tournament of their year. If there was one tournament to base your Worlds team off of, it was this one. And at this tournament, Big Six came back with a vengeance and a new look. It's time to talk about the final variant of Big Six that I haven't mentioned yet, one with a letter that we haven't even used. This is Big B for Bronzong. Funnily enough, Alex Gomez had used Bronzong himself in that early Wakefield tournament. Since then, it hadn't seen much use. Alex himself dropped it for UK Nats. But Bronzong did one thing very well. Something Big Six needed right now. It matched up well into both dual primals and Xerneas. Xerneas had started to give the Thunderous variants of Big Six a hard time, but Bronzong's matchup into Xerneas was incredibly good. In addition to Trick Room turning Xerneas' speed against it, Bronzong's natural steel typing and ridiculous bulk gave it the special distinction of being one of the only Pokemon in the game to be able to survive 2 Geomancy boosted Moonblasts, after which it could fire back with a Gyro Ball, a move that did massive damage even with no attack investment, because it does more damage based on how much faster the target is than the user. Bronzong is quite slow, and Geomancy doubles Xerneas' speed, capping out Gyro Ball's base power. Bronzong's dual primal matchup was a bit more complex, mostly because you had 2 paths forward. First, just like Cresselia, you could use Skill Swap. Bronzong also has Levitate. This would give you an advantage against opposing Primal Groudon, as you'd be immune to their ground type attacks. The problem was, other teams featured Skill Swap too, and if they used Skill Swap on their Primal Groudon, well, suddenly you wouldn't be able to touch them either. And so, Skill Swap actually wasn't the main weapon that Bronzong used. Instead, it featured 2 different Psychic type moves. Gravity, which not only causes all flying and floating Pokemon to land, making them susceptible to ground moves, but also increases the accuracy of all moves across the board, which combos with Hypnosis, a 100% accurate sleep move inside of Gravity. Of course, Gravity has the added benefit of making the inaccurate Precipice Blades always hit. And now, if your opponent skill swapped their Kyogre or Groudon, you could still hit them with Precipice Blades. At the second most important tournament of the year, Big Six played its trump card, and the result was clear. Big B popped off at US Nationals, giving Big Six a way to disrupt dual primals, while only changing that usual rotating 6th man slot, keeping the core roster intact with its good matchups into everything else. The finals featured 2 Big Six variants, Big C against Dr. Aaron Traylor's Big BC, as he dropped Kangaskhan to have both Cresselia and Bronzong. In the end, the Big C team won. And for the last time before Worlds, at the biggest tournament of the year thus far, Big Six made up half of the teams in top 8. The other 2 Big Six teams, for those curious, were Big B. All our efforts to stop it had failed. At the end of the day, it had outlasted, out-adapted, and outfought its enemies. The two final hopes to take it down, Kyogre and Dual Primals, had both made top 4, only to lose to Big 6 teams in the end. This, it seemed, was the final curtain. Months and months of effort, the combined attempts of the best players in the world, and it hadn't been enough. Big 6 had won. There were no more testing grounds, no more chances. If you were gonna try something new to beat Big 6 and its various heads, you'd be going in without tournament practice, that vital component in seeing if you held up versus the field. Anyone attempting such a feat wouldn't just be shooting blind, they'd be gambling their biggest tournament of the year. At every point of the year so far, Big 6 had laughed in the face of those who thought it could be stopped. Emotionally, the community understood. This was probably it. Big 6 couldn't be stopped. We'd tried, but it was too strong. Almost a full season of dominance, and he falters quickly righted. The strongest team in history. The only thing left in its warpath was a world championship victory. But Big 6 did not win the world championships that year. And originally, I intended to give you a very short version of that story here in this video. But this video is already about twice as long as I intended it to be. And truthfully, to properly tell the story of the 2016 Pokemon World Championships, I'm gonna need a little bit more time. So, I hope you'll forgive me, but this isn't the full story.